Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here for this very timely event on the implications of the killing of Qassem Soleimani for the Middle East. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lina Khatib. I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa program here at Chatham House. And it's a pleasure to introduce four colleagues who will join me for what I'm sure will be a very vivid discussion tonight that is also, by the way, being live streamed. So if someone you know can't be here and wants to be here, tell them to watch us online. The event is obviously on the record as well. Please feel free to tweet, quote us, do the usual, but keep your phones on silent. We're going to have a discussion that spans implications for Iran, US foreign policy, as well as Iraq. We're going to start with my colleague, Lindsay Newman, who's a senior research fellow with the US and Americas program here at Chatham House, followed by remarks from my colleague, Dr. Sanam Vakil, who is the Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program and leads our work on Iran and the Gulf, followed with Professor Toby Dodge, who's an Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, and also Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. And last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Renad Mansour, Senior Research Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, and he directs our Iraq initiative, which is a major project on Iraq that we've been running for more than a year now, and that is ongoing. So without further ado, I think we're going to jump straight into considering that the United States is the one who took the decision to kill Soleimani. How does this relate to the United States policy towards Iran, and what do we learn from this killing?
Thank you, Lina, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to focus my time on making really 4 points. The first is to provide some broad framing of U.S. foreign policy under Donald Trump. The second is to look specifically at Trump's policy vis-a-vis Iran and the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Third, I will offer some thoughts on where U.S. policy is likely to go vis-a-vis Iran. And finally, I just want to highlight a couple of points around what this means for the U.S. and the upcoming November elections in the U.S. So first, Donald Trump's foreign policy generally is guided by an America First principle, as we all know. It's really about emphasizing strength at home over engagement abroad. But what this means in practice is that Trump's policy is really transactional. So Trump and his administration look for engagements abroad where there's obvious direct benefit that's going to flow to the U.S., to his domestic audience, and really to his base. And this is why he tends to prefer bilateral engagements like bilateral trade deals, so U.S.-South Korea, U.S.-Japan, and even bilateral aggressions like U.S.-North Korea, U.S.-China, and in this case, U.S.-Iran, over multilateral aggressions and engagements, because it's not entirely clear where the benefit in a multilateral engagement goes with a zero-sum sort of framework. So it's worth highlighting that this is different from President Barack Obama's cautious multilateralism. He really had a never-go-it-alone approach, and Trump is very comfortable taking unilateral and decisive action. We know this most prominently with his over-reliance or reliance on executive actions like sanctions and tariffs. And of course, he prefers that really over diplomatic routes and protracted military engagements. So what does this all mean for Iran and for the killing of Qassem Soleimani? Well, this takes me to my second point. Trump has been clear since he was candidate Trump about his views around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. He views it as a bad deal in which too much money went to Iran and not much came back in return. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin was here this weekend, and he really reiterated this view. So Trump's plan was always to withdraw the U.S. from the JCPOA, which he did in May 2018. And to be clear, what Trump wants is a new deal and a non-nuclear Iran. And we can debate how feasible this is and how different this is as an objective from where President Barack Obama started when he started the JCPOA negotiations. But it's worth underlining and repeating again. What Trump wants is a new deal and to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And he certainly does have, and he has had members of his administration, of course, most notably former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who were looking for regime change or regime collapse. But another massively destabilized country in the Middle East is not in the US best interest, it's not in Trump's best interest. And I tend to think that Trump knows that. What he wants is a new JCPOA with his name on it, similar to the new NAFTA or the USMCA, which he actually signed today. For a new deal to be possible, the US policy towards Iran really continues to be guided by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's statements in his May 2018 speech with the 12 demands, where he said that for a new nuclear deal to be advanced, Iran would need to curb its uranium enrichments, put limitations on its ballistic missile program, curb its regional destabilizing activity, stop backing terrorist activity, et cetera. And of course, we all know the final piece of the puzzle is a US commitment to apply maximum pressure on Iran to get it to comply with these demands and drive it back to the negotiating table. This maximum pressure campaign is really essentially a protracted sanctions play by Trump. And in my view, I would argue that it has not clearly advanced either of his objectives of a new nuclear deal or a non-nuclear Iran. Within this context, and in direct response to the killing of an American contractor in Iraq and protests and the storming of the US embassy in Baghdad, we all know now that Trump took the decision to kill Qassem Soleimani, really to remove Qassem Soleimani from the equation. We also likely all know that Trump took this decision from a panoply. He was offered a menu of options, including several that were much less disruptive. But he took the decision to kill Qassem Soleimani, which is very consistent with this unilateral America First approach to foreign policy generally and his maximum pressure campaign on Iran in particular. So where does US policy go from here? Well, despite initial fears that we were on the brink of the next world war, or at least a direct conflict between the two sides, with the benefit of some hindsight, it appears that the Trump administration, its intentions was twofold, really to demonstrate an overwhelming military capability and a willingness to take game-changing strategic, we'll call it, action. And the targeted intention outcome was for Iran to de-escalate, which the Trump administration thinks it has done. We know this because on January 8th in the speech, Donald Trump said that Iran appeared to be standing down. So going forward, the bottom line for the Trump administration is that in their view, maximum pressure is working. Steve Mnuchin again reiterated that this weekend at Chatham House. And so we should expect to see more sanctions, not less of them. This means more sanctions directly on Iran and its proxies, as well as entities operating and trading with Iran, similar to the sanctions we just saw imposed on firms out of Dubai, Hong Kong, and China that were imposed last week. Now, finally, just a few words on what all of this means for the US and the upcoming US 2020 elections in November. Conventional wisdom tells us that foreign policy tends not to matter all that much for US elections. But we appear to be seeing a bit of a shift in that. We know, at least with the Trump administration, America First approach always means that an eye is kept on how actions abroad affect the domestic audience. US foreign policy towards Iran and the Middle East in general now appears to be posed to be a critical, a central issue for the upcoming 2020 elections. To President Donald Trump, the decision to kill Qassem Soleimani really represents a campaign promise kept to confront Iran's aggression. It also means that on the campaign trail, we're going to expect to see him saying that he has overseen a national security policy, a new national security policy on Iran that began with the withdrawal from the US JCPOA all the way through to the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Given almost certain continued covert and proxy efforts by Iran to counter US interests in the region, I'm going to be watching for Democratic candidates to say that the US policy, Trump's policy, makes the US interest and the US less safe, not more safe. We're already seeing the re-escalation of protests at the US Embassy in Baghdad amidst mortar attacks. And there's this very open question around the future of US military presence in Iraq, a key Iranian objective. Democratic candidates also need to be explicit about what they see, how they're going to manage US tensions with Iran from a military, strategic, and diplomatic perspective. And when I last checked, only former Vice President Joe Biden has an explicit policy on his website right now about how he plans to deal with Iran. Finally, in any event, it's hard for me to see how the Trump administration and Iran return to the negotiating table ahead of November. We will just need to, and my baseline case remains that we need to have clarity on the next U.S. administration before any new movement, any real movement on a deal.
Okay, thank you so much. So from implications for the U.S. to implications for Iran itself.
Okay, thank you very much, Lena. And it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I have a hard task to lay out before you because there is so much to discuss. And in order to go forward or to discuss the implications, I think it's just important to quickly look backwards to see where we've come from. And this current stalemate between Tehran and Washington really originates obviously from the Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA in May 2018 and Iran's shift in posture in May 2019, where it began a more confrontational approach to push back against maximum pressure. And we analysts refer to that as Iran's maximum resistance strategy. And this strategy was designed to obtain as much leverage as possible to try and alter the Trump position vis-a-vis Iran, and to perhaps gain some leverage if and when Iran should come back to the negotiating table with the Trump administration or with another American administration. And in this ratcheting up of tensions on Iran's side, we have seen since May 2019, Iran begin incremental breaches in the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, and it is now in its 5th breach of the nuclear agreement. And the deal is in peril, and I think that many European countries and the United States really think the deal is, practically only alive in theory at this point, with Iran moving forward in its nuclear program. At the same time, we have seen escalatory behavior sponsored by Iran in the Straits of Hormuz and in the Persian Gulf last summer, with the seizing of tankers, for example, the downing of a U.S. drone, and indirect sponsored Iranian activity from proxies affiliated and sponsored by Iran around the region. At the same time, we also saw the September 14th very brazen attacks on Saudi oil facilities as well. And it's important to consider that the escalation has been building for months on end, and January 3rd did not come out of the blue. And in all of these escalatory events, there was no American response. There was no military response, no move to establish deterrence. And in many cases, I was surprised myself, waiting for what that American response would be. So January 3rd, I think, is that turning point moment where the Trump administration calculated, after the events in Baghdad, that Iran is pushing this envelope 1 degree too far, and it was time to establish deterrence. The question is, has it established deterrence? And of course, in the days and weeks that followed, there was a lot of speculation, a lot of anxiety as to how things were going to unfold. And no, we did not end up in World War III. But sadly, I should tell you that this is not over, because Iran remains under maximum pressure. Sanctions continue to trickle out of the Trump administration. They believe that maximum pressure is working, and it might be working to constrain the Iranian economy, which is, of course, in a recession. We have indeed seen protests on the streets of Tehran in last November that were quite brutally cracked down. We have also seen examples of Iranian mismanagement after the killing of Qassem Soleimani, when the Ukrainian airliner was tragically brought down, and there was denial and obfuscation from that event as well, followed by protests on Tehranian streets by a different cohort of Iranians. So there's been a lot that should be interpreted, digested, and it's, I think, unfortunate that Washington, from these events, is taking away that the Iranian government is planning on coming to the table or conceding. I actually believe that the reverse is happening, and let me explain to you why. A few reasons. First of all, there are some domestic implications to the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Of course, he was an important military figure. He was a symbolic figure for many people in Iran because the government very much promoted his image as someone who fought against ISIS and protected Iran from ISIS. And so while he was very much despised in many Arab countries around the world, and perhaps rightly so, within Iran, he was very much supported. And so these conflicting narratives have to be appreciated and understood within the local context. And Qassem Soleimani was also appreciated inside Iran because he was not political. He was not factional. He didn't get involved in anything administrative. And so he represented a sort of national narrative of Iran under containment in a region, etc. But the domestic implications here is that the JCPOA is fragile. The economic consequences of maximum pressure are hurting in Iran. And what we are seeing now is that the political space for debate, specifically around Iranian pragmatist and reformist politicians, is narrowing. They have less ability to maneuver, and you know, many people in the U.S. administration don't support this narrative of factionalism, don't think it matters, but there are cleavages that do matter in Iran, and we're going to see how they matter in the coming months and weeks. Actually, Iran is going to have parliamentary elections in February, and it is widely expected that hardliners are going to win outright. Of course, they're vetted in advance, and we know that reformists have been already rejected quite widely. So we know that this is going to be a very conservative parliament, but that's going to, of course, have implications for political debate, but ultimately really important for local issues. But it does change the tenor of the conversation, and it does allow the political establishment to be dominated by conservatives, and that matters. Because conservatives have a different worldview in Iran and maybe less interested in engagement, less interested in international negotiations, more about resistance and standing up to the United States, and more about escalation, actually. So today, on January 29th, it might appear that Iran's a bit more constrained in the region, but there is a long-term, probably strategic pushback that is coming from the conservative, security-oriented establishment that will come and we will see play out in the coming months of this year, designed to challenge the Trump administration's perception that maximum pressure is working, to also go back to the strategy of obtaining leverage. And how are they going to do that? They are going to use their playbook, and their playbook is going back to plausible deniability, relying on their proxy relationships on the one hand, but also, of course, opening the aperture and perhaps transferring their own economic pain and their own instability onto their neighbors. So that means they will continue to threaten or even perhaps eventually renew some sort of direct, I think, engagement with maybe some of their Gulf neighbors that have supported the maximum pressure campaign. And the more Iran, I think, under this conservative political space feels constrained, the more they're going to pass on the pressure to the region. So I think that should be very much on our minds, and it's something that we should be watching and be very concerned about. Additionally, this is a long year. It's only January 29th, and to me it already feels like it's September. But the Iranian government has to survive until November 3rd. We all have to survive until November 3rd to see what the outcome of the U.S. election is going to be. And so how they react has to be incremental and managed throughout this year. They, on the one hand, want to see what is going to happen, as Lindsay said, on November 3rd, if Trump is going to be reelected. And that's going to be part of their calculation in how to engage, how to obtain leverage, how to manage their situation going forward. And at the same time, we have the sort of slow-going crisis with the JCPOA, the European signatories of the deal, the E3 have escalated the issue of Iran's breaches in a process called a dispute resolution mechanism, which is designed, hopefully, to bring the parties back to the table to try and encourage or pressure Iran's compliance in exchange, perhaps, for something. The European strategy is to prolong this process and also prolong this process to November 3rd. So we are in a waiting game, we are in a stalemate, but it's a very dangerous one. So we might be back here again for another one of these conversations, probably in the next few months. But from Tehran's perspective, unfortunately, their response to the killing of Soleimani and the attack on the base in Iraq was not it. It was something more, inevitably something more is coming.
Okay. Well, on that positive note, let's move to more positive implications for the political system in Iraq, Toby, or maybe not?
Yeah, I think we have short and long-term consequences of what happened on the evening of the 2nd and 3rd of December. Firstly, there was obviously a nationalist backlash that was exploited by the very people who up until that date had been on the back foot. The pro-Iranian forces in parliament and on the streets. We saw the parliament, although not quorate and subject to a huge intimidation campaign, a vote to expel American troops on the 5th of January. Trump responded with talking about sanctions on Iraq as well as Iran. And then the acting Prime Minister Adel Abdul-Mahdi called Secretary of State Pompeo on the 9th of January saying, can you send a team to negotiate? And he said no. And then we have Jim Jeffries, a senior figure working on the Middle Eastern State Department, saying, yeah, sure, we can negotiate, but it's not only troops, it'll be money and everything else. But that's a short-term consequence. I think the much longer-term consequence, and I think where damage may have been done to Iraqi politics, to understand that, we have to go back to the 1st of October. And as everyone knows, from the 1st of October onwards, there have been a massive set of incredibly powerful demonstrations, first in Baghdad's Tahrir Square, then across the whole of southern Iraq down to Basra, where young people, up to 1 million young people, have come onto the streets of Iraq repeatedly. And what were they doing? They were demanding the shrinking of the power of the very groups empowered again by the US strikes on the assassination of Soleimani and a chap that Renat will talk about, Abdul-Mahdi al-Mohandes. So this is the great problem, that from the 1st of October onwards, you had the most important protest movement, the largest mass movement in Iraq since 2003. And those young people firstly came onto the streets to protest against the lack of hope for the future, their lack of jobs, their lack of progress. But that quickly expanded into a very targeted and astute critique of the post-2003 political system in Iraq that has generated systemically, politically protected corruption. And from that stage, the demonstrators went on to develop a series of demands, both short-term and long-term, that if granted, would revolutionize Iraq, would revolutionize the political system. Firstly, they demanded the resignation of the government. As the government stepped up violence against them, they got their first wish when Adel Abdul-Mahdi, the prime minister, was forced to resign because of reaction to the use of violence. Now they've demanded the complete reform of the electoral laws to try and break up the dominance of the old post-2003 political parties, a lot of them Shia Islamist parties dominating Iraq, and they've demanded a sweeping reform, sending corrupt politicians to prison. I think this, and they've refused to get off the streets. There have been mass demonstrations 2009, 2010, and especially 2015, but they were bought off by a promise, empty promises of reform, the use of violence and the use of propaganda. These young people, nearly 600 now killed by state forces, have refused to go home. They're still on the streets tonight in Baghdad and across the south. It's that challenge which has the most potential for positive movement. And what worries me, it's that challenge that has to some extent been undermined by these attacks, because it's allowed the forces that are being challenged by those demonstrations, pro-Iranian parties, parties of the status quo, to rally and hide where they're most comfortable behind the decent drapery of nationalism. So I think that's the destructive outcome of the instant gratification of Trump's assassination of Soleimani and Mohandes. It has done exactly the opposite you would have thought a US president would have wanted to achieve in Iraq. First, it's rallied a section of public opinion against the continued US presence, but much, much more importantly, it's allowed for the status quo powers, the pro-Iranian powers in Iraq to challenge their greatest fear, a popular mobilization in the name of a secular nationalism that undermines the ideological justification of the post-2003 system, highlights its corruption, and has set out a manifesto for sweeping away that corruption, that sectarianism, and the elite that were empowered after 2003.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, obviously, you've mentioned two very important forces in Iraq who are the elites in power as well as, of course, the people on the street. And that leaves the Iran-allied armed groups and political parties in the country. Renaud, where do they stand?
Thank you, Lina. I think there's something that I've been looking at, which is this debate. Immediately after the attack, there emerged this debate of whether this was a good decision. And you have proponents who actually think this was a good decision because they say, not only did you get rid of, a senior Iranian general, but the US was waning in influence in Iraq. And because of that, this is almost like a shock to that system. And as was said, a game changer. And then there's the other side of the debate, which is what Toby has kind of outlined, which is to say, this is another mission accomplished moment. America has militarily struck in Iraq, not thinking about the day after, not thinking about what comes in the long term. So in the short term, if you count it, America looks like it's won another battle. But I think the bigger argument is, has it won the war, right? And to answer that question, I think we need to look at where Iran is in all of this. As Toby said, right before this attack, Iran was on the back foot in Iraq. These protests that erupted in the south and in Baghdad, where predominantly Shia, although it wasn't sect-defined, Shia Iraqis, protesting not just against the political system, but Iran itself, saying we want Iran out of our country. And so Iran was on the back foot. Iran usually relies on the Iraqi political leadership. Qassem Soleimani was known to be able to bring everyone together, working with networks, and he was unable to. The parliament was dysfunctional. The prime minister had resigned, and there was an inability of these groups to come together to pick someone else. So Iran was failing both at the street politics, but also at the national politics. And because of that, as Toby suggested, having to perhaps resort to more coercive and violent means to deal with this massive threat. So then the attack happens. And Iran is presented with an opportunity. All of a sudden, there's an attempt to change the narrative from reform to undermine what these protesters have been arguing about and to say, actually, the biggest threat in Iraq remains the US. And this argument has never gone away. Those same forces have for years been trying to have US troops withdraw from Iraq, but everyone in the last few years would say, what do you mean? The US doesn't really have an influence, like it's not a big deal, right? And many of Iraqis would say Iran is the bigger sort of occupying power now. Many of the protesters would say that. So this presented an opportunity to bring back anti-Americanism. And Iran turned to probably the king of anti-Americanism in post-2003 Iraq, and that is Muqtada al-Sadr. Right? Sadr, the head of the Mahdi army, had fought against the Americans for a long time, and he was currently living in Iran. And so there are two things that happen, I think, in the last week, that begin to question and undermine that narrative. So in Iraq, since 2003, at times of crises, Iran is able to bring together the political elite, especially the Shia elite, around this external threat of the US. So Muqtada al-Sadr promised a 1 million-man march last Friday, right? His people were calling it the second 1920s revolution, referring to the 1920 revolution when the Shia South revolted against the British rule. He got maybe 150, 200,000 protesters at max. So this was clearly an indication that the same Sadr who was able to bring all these people together under anti-Americanism is not really able to do so anymore. These protests that Toby talked about have pierced right through that ethno-sectarian logic that has defined Iraq since 2003. And I think that's clear. Then something else happens that evening. Sadr demands that his supporters, because keep in mind that Muqtada in 2016 had supported the protest movements, tells his supporters to leave the streets and they refuse. And I spoke to one of them. And he told me, he said, we've been here for 4 months with all these protesters protesting. Why would we leave our brothers because he's telling us? We still have issues. We still want reform. So the point of all this is to say that Muqtada, Sadr, and the other leadership in Iraq have been less able to use anti-Americanism in a way, the idea and concept, to gain legitimacy. Now, what that suggests, sadly, is that if they can't rely on that, then they'll have to use different means to get their way. And I think what you're seeing and what you'll continue to see is the use of violence by different groups to bring down these protests, which, as Toby said, represent the greatest existential threat to that post-2003 political system.
Okay, thank you so much. I have questions, but I'm also mindful of the time. So I'm going to go straight to the audience because there's so many of you here tonight. If you don't mind, please introduce yourself before you ask the question, especially if you are a Chatham House member. Tell us what else you do in life, if anything. And please, because there's so many of you and I'm expecting a lot of questions, keep your questions short, no comments, no speeches, otherwise I will cut you off. So we're going to start with, I'm being honest, start with Nazanin in the middle. Just wait for the microphone, please. Remember, we are being live streamed in the middle there.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for a most thought-provoking session. My question is my name is Nazanin Ansari. I'm a member of Chatham House, and I also am the editor of online publications, Kayhan Life and Kayhan London, Iranian British journals. So my question is to Sanam, and I wanted to ask you, Sanam, how do you explain this divergence of views about those such as yourself and other experts who believe that still there is a chance that there is a genuine competition between reformists and conservatives or pragmatists in Iran, and those on the streets who've been on the streets not only in 1 month of 2019, but since December 2017. And those experts, yes, in Washington, but the people in Iran on the streets saying that there is no difference, whether it's reformist or conservative, it is just the same old Islamic Republic and a theocracy.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions. I think there was one on this side. Yes.
Thank you very much to Renat and Toby, maybe, Inarodo from King's College London, research fellow. My question is regarding to Sadr. Now, you all mentioned that he has been very successful in navigating the mood, but how much do you think he's currently risking in alienating his own base by posing, for example, like with leaders like Akram Ka'abi and sort of like reviving his Jaish al-Mahdi? Thank you.
Great. There was a question at the very back there.
Hey, Casey Dwyer. I'm a member of Chatham House, a macro strategist for a hedge fund outside of Chatham House, and thanks for coming tonight. My question concerns Iran's economy. The IMF reported that the balance of payments for Iran is going to result in a currency crisis, and the United States government reported, I think it was, that their access to their available capital is only half of what the IMF has reported. So I guess question to the group is, when does this come to a head, and is it this year?
Okay, thank you so much. So we've got Iran's economy, Muqtada Sadr, and the reformist conservative dichotomy. Let's start with you, Sanam. 2 questions on Iran.
Okay. I'll take the economy first. It's very hard, I think, to make predictions about the sustainability of Iran's economy, really, because the Iranian government is not being as transparent about its fiscal health, its exports, its reserves, because it is portraying this crisis as economic warfare. So you can judge the analysis, you can judge the numbers. And I have a hard time squaring those numbers and that analysis with what I hear from people also in Iran. And I hear everything. I hear everything's fine. I hear the restaurants are full. I hear the government is spending money beautifying the parks. And I hear that people are struggling to find medicine and having a hard time buying food, and that inflation is high. So I can't make predictions because I don't go back to Iran and I don't have access to the data. So it's very hard to know. But what I can tell you is that I don't believe that the Islamic Republic will come to the negotiating table solely based on inflation or GDP or employment numbers, because the Islamic Republic is an autocratic state. And it has coercive power, and we've seen that coercive power on display repeatedly over the past decades. They will come to the table, if they come to the table, when they come to the table. I do believe they will come to the table, let me say that. When they feel that they are in a position domestically and regionally to do so, when it is in their interest to come to the table. And I think that right now they feel that they are far away from the floor, and they are far away from a Venezuela scenario. And I think that they have demonstrated that they can handle a Venezuela scenario. And they look around at all of the different scenarios out there that the Trump administration has tried, whether it's negotiations with North Korea, whether it's the relationship with Venezuela, even the ongoing U.S. relationship with Cuba. And I think that the jury is still out on whether they feel that they can come to the table with this guy. There are some people in the country that make the argument that this is the president to make the deal with, because it is all about just putting Trump in front of the JCPOA. But at the same time, there is a question of ideology, and the supreme leader is really, there's one thing he has been committed to as supreme leader for 30 years, and that's been anti-American sentiment and seeking to see the U.S. reduce, diminish, particularly in the Middle East. So, I can't say more than that on that issue. Then to Nazanin's question, this is a difficult one and not one that I can even attempt to unpack in a minute here. I think, the Iranian system is an authoritarian system, and it has a stronger, informal, unelected system of governance than it does an elected system of governance. But yet, in a 40-year period, whether it's been coerced or whether it has been voluntary, and we have seen examples and signs of both, people have come out to vote and have helped determine and surprise us at the election box. And this is what makes the study of Iran quite interesting, because it is not predictable. And it continues to surprise us. Iran, yes, is a theocracy, but the dynamics in Iranian society are very much changing. And to reduce it solely to the views of an Iranian diaspora, like myself, I will put myself in there, I haven't been back for 10 years, would be unjust to understand what is happening inside Iran. The views of the younger generation have changed. There are people that come out to protest on economic reasons. There are people that have come out to protest on political reasons. But there is a reason why the Islamic Republic has been resilient for 40 years. And the problem is that it is a coercive state, but it is a state that has been also equally successful at preventing the emergence of indigenous leadership. And also, at the same time, I think the problem also rests in the diaspora that overly politicizes everything that happens in Iran and doesn't allow for Iranian indigenous voices to come out and express the dichotomy of views and the contradictions and often competing narratives that exist in Iran. Iran is not a monolith. It's not a homogenous place. It is a complex place where people can like Soleimani and hate the Islamic Republic.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to move to Renad, the question on Muqtada al-Sadr now.
It's funny because my colleagues who work on the U.S. often complain that they have to sort of speak for Trump, and it's so hard to speak for someone unpredictable. And I was like, we have to deal with Muqtada al-Sadr, who is known to be a chameleon, who one day, will do the anti-American thing, and one day will do the anti-Iran thing. And I think it's important, when you understand the sort of Sadrist movement, to view it as a movement and not a political party. And so not that it's not an organization we have a very clear command structure, although he is the head of that movement. And that movement, I mean, Ben Robin, who works on this, and I will publish something soon on you know, what Muqtada wants, because that's what everyone is interested in now vis-a-vis what's happened. He's clearly tried to make a play, especially, we talk about Qassem Soleimani, but the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis is massive for Iraqi politics. He was very much seen as one of the main architects of what was going to happen in sort of vis-a-vis the response to not just protests, but the political elite. And so there's a space there, and Sadr was the first to kind of really come out and try and fill that vacuum in by going to some of his former enemies, including those that are part of the Al-Hajj al-Sha'bi, as you mentioned. I would say the Sadrist movement, you can split it up into three groups, and Ben and I wrote about this. One are the sort of, you can call them, I mean, obviously the militia, as you mentioned, the Jaysh al-Mahdi, so the armed group. The other group would be the clerics, so there's a religious side to it. And the final group is the sort of political and civic, sort of civil society angle to the Sadrist movement, which is really the one on the streets. Now, these three groups rarely interact with each other, but they're all guided by this sort of principle of Sadr, especially his father, Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. What's clearly happening now is a part of the political and civic movement that was part of the Sadrist movement is no longer willing to you know, respond or obey the orders if they believe something is not to them, right? So, and so that's why I mentioned with the whole anti-Americanism, Muqtada is no longer able to just sway them one way or another, and there's a big debate of whether he ever was, because he was also someone who, I think, it was you who said this. What's your anthropologist thing?
I'll say in a minute. Don't steal it.
Unfortunately, I won't steal it, although it's pretty good, and he'll say it. But to conclude, I think, look at where Muqtada has been since October in Iran. Various theories why he's there. Partly he was at risk in Iraq. His movement he was losing that grip on power, but also he's looking to, some people would say, gain religious credentials, so he's clearly feeling that he needs to be in Iran. And so this was an opportunity to come back. And again, if you view it as a movement and not as a political party, what you'll see is it's very fragmented, and Muqtada will have to make certain compromises to be able to take over this. But again, the point still remains, I think this is really the first time since 2003 that the political leadership in Iraq is so fragmented that not one leader, from Maliki to Sadr, to some of the Hashid, to others, feel that they actually have control over the process.
Yes.
Thank you. He's setting up the... Anyway, so what I used to say, and luckily someone's remembered it, is that
I almost remember.
Sadr has I think, a very big pair of anthropological ears, and he would listen and carefully track the opinion of his core support base. And he was incredibly good at both networking them and keeping with them. And so you see in Sadr, or you used to see in Sadr, the sometimes contradictory ideological trends of urban, working class, quite often young men. And so you saw him go from a kind of a rallying anti-American nationalism, claiming unitary brotherhood between Sunni and Shia through, and let's be frank about this, the Jaysh al-Mahdi being one of the key forces driving the civil war forward in Iraq, and then demobilizing the Jaysh al-Mahdi and moving in to a reformist protest movement. And during that time, he had comparative, relative autonomy from Iran. The Iranians penetrated Jaysh al-Mahdi, split it into competing factions, and only once or twice, and the crucial moment was in 2010, when against his own supporters, he backed Nouri al-Maliki getting a second term, and then he issued a statement which is basically saying, I'm really sorry, but you don't understand the pressure I'm being placed in. And it comes to today, as Renad was saying, he runs the danger of splitting his movement or breaking his legitimacy, because he's clearly swimming against the tide of his base and of public opinion. And if you look at a lot of the people, especially initially, who were shot and murdered in Tahrir Square, they came from Sadr City, his base within Baghdad. So why did he do that? And I think Vinod's touched on it. Two things. One, he came under immense pressure from Tehran, where he was resident because he believed he's safer under Iranian protection in Tehran than he would in Qom in Iran than he would be in Baghdad. But two, it's a power play. I think during the protest movement, but especially with the rise of the Hashd-e-Shaabi after 2014, the Sadrist movement, especially its military wing, has become weak. So what he was trying to do was step into the space vacated by the assassination and the murder of Mohandas, who was the great Hashid centralizer. But in doing that, he's taken a huge gamble, because I don't think the Iranians will let him grow much stronger, and he has betrayed, or at least confused and fractured his support base across Baghdad and southern Iraq.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to move to a next round of questions. I'm going to also take 3. We're going to start with you, sir. Just wait for the microphone.
Hello, my name is Human. I'm a researcher in international security at the University of Sussex. Actually, I have 2 questions. And okay. So I'm Iranian. Yeah. I was just wondering that don't you think that killing the General Soleimani is related to the peace deal of Mr. Trump, which happened just 2 days ago? Because as far as we know, the only country which is supporting Palestine in the Middle East, I mean, the government, the people, everyone is supposed, is Iran. So don't you think it's related to the peace deal with Israel?
Thanks a lot. We've got, you had a question at the front. Yeah, if you could just also wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. Hilda, I'm a member of Chatham House and I run the Centre for International Peace Building. I'm sort of picking up an undercurrent in all your presentations, and thank you for them, which is like the shifting of tectonic plates between an ideologically driven agenda and what I would want to term not so much nationalism as a kind of patriotism, where people will say, we don't like what he's doing, but he's one of us. And I think that is breaking through a kind of pragmatic identifying within your own borders for a positive political change agenda. And I just wonder whether this is something that resonates with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have lots of hands, but we have to go to the back, very back. Yes.
Thank you. Dominic Carratu, member of Chatham House and a banker for my living. Again, thank you very much for the presentation. To keep it brief, America first, pulling out of the Middle East, trying to sort of do deals on the way through, but the Iranians aren't just going to kowtow and just give in tomorrow. So I agree with all that. If you were the Iranians, wouldn't you look to someone like Russia, maybe, as an ally or partner to change the tectonic plates, like Syria did?
Okay, thank you. Lindsay, we're going to start with you.
Sure, please. Well, I'll take the peace deal question, and I could touch on the patriotism question. You know, I take your point. For me, the peace deal, which of course was released after a long-stalled, long-awaited process yesterday, for me, the timing reflects more on domestic dynamics for both Israel and the U.S. than it does anything specific to Iran and Qassem Soleimani. Bibi obviously was indicted yesterday and is under a lot of domestic pressures, going up against his 3rd or 4th election. And he's now going to use sort of mapping that came out of the peace deal to go forward with annexation of the West Bank further. So there's that dynamic. And then, of course, at home, it is a campaign promise kept for Donald Trump to release a peace plan. So for me, the peace plan has less to do with Qassem Soleimani than it does with domestic dynamics for both Israel and the U.S. I take your point as well. I mean, I think it's an expedient foreign policy. I think in that sense, you know, I often say that Trump is not ideological about many things, and I think it is more of an America First expediency, a patriotism. I like your point.
Is going to be a pivot to Russia?
Well, Russia and Iran have had a checkered but long-standing history that I think many countries have been trying to peel back in different ways, whether it's in Syria or pragmatic cooperation in Central Asia. I think this is a relationship that, of course, has deepened, particularly during times of strain with or this containment period that is now back. And the Russians are definitely helping the Iranians. And I think that the hardline security establishment finds comfort in its relationship with Russia's own hardline security establishment as well. So there's a natural gravity there that I think, Putin has, made easy headway in the Middle East, not just because of Trump, also because of Obama. And it's important to call out President Obama for that. I know everybody misses him, but we do have to acknowledge he didn't cross a red line. And this resulted in growing Iranian influence and growing Russian influence. So the Russians have diversified relations all around, and how they manage that is really quite interesting. But the relationship with Iran is not one that is easily resolvable. It's very compartmentalized, and I think it will continue to be so going forward. Just on the tectonic plates quickly, I mean, nationalism has always been a strong facet of Iranian identity that seemingly, I think, many Middle Eastern countries have forgotten, and as it was wrapped up in Islamic ideology, and as that Islamic ideology is waning in Iran, and it is waning in Iran, you just might not see it or hear it, but it's happening, and it's probably going to come as there's leadership transition in the Islamic Republic. That nationalism will be even stronger. And unfortunately, I think the bad news is for the United States or for many regional countries who think that things will change should Iran, remove the Islamic from the Republic. That national impulse is always going to be there. It was there under the Shah, and it's going to stay there.
Okay. Right. I'm going to move to the final round, unless you have something very quick to say on that.
Very quick.
Okay.
Something important across the region on this question is the generational shift that's happening. So in Iraq especially, I think over 2/3 of the population is under 25. And so when these elite come back and try and use the anti-American or even the Saddam Hussein card to try and, it's not working because all they know is the current leaders they have. And I think across the region, where you see in Lebanon elsewhere, are these youth, these kids coming out and saying that we're not sectarian, we've never been sectarian. This whole idea the genie has been let out the bottle in 2003 does not exist. And I think that trend will continue with the generational shift in the countries.
Right. We don't have much time. I want to say thank you for keeping your questions short so far. Keep doing that. And to my panelists, they've done better than you. Keep your answers short. So, final round. Yes.
Thank you. Mike Stevens, I'm an independent researcher. So just one question. Switching to an almost advisory look at the problem, what could be done or what should be done in order to get the protest movement in Iraq back to that positive place it was and repair the damage that has been done, if we agree that damage has been done to it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And yes, just wait for the microphone. Very front row. Yeah.
Dina Ramadan, Oxford Center for Islamic Study. My question, and a member of the House, my question is to Lindsay. Lindsay, I'm a little bit confused about the American positions toward the killing of Soleimani. As far as I know, he is a terrorist like Baghdadi. He killed a lot of people and everything. So why one should celebrate the killing of Baghdadi while be skeptical or denounce the killing of Soleimani? This is one. Another one, what are the implications for the own Syrian file?
Okay. Well, we're going to have one more question from you. Yeah, third row from the back. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Wilson Fash, freelance journalist. My question is regarding the killing of Qassem Soleimani. Right after his death, defenders said, well, he had a very important role in the fight against ISIS. But did he have an important role, actually? What do you assess was exactly his role in that war?
Okay, thank you so much. Right, quick fire answers, starting with you again, Lindsay.
I think it's important that we distinguish between the American population and the Trump administration and Trump himself. In their view, in the Trump administration's view, there was initially, they suggested that there was this imminent threat of an attack on U.S. assets and interests. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper then sort of slipped and said, regardless of what was coming, he was, a threat to the U.S. in the past. So I think it's important to distinguish between, between the U.S., which is a vast, diverse country, and the Trump administration and their objectives.
Okay, great. So would you like to take the what should reinvigorate the protests and get it back on track? Yeah, Toby?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thank you. The protest movement is a massive watershed moment in post-2003 Iraq. And it's a revolt against a system set up after the Anglo-American invasion. So not only does Washington, although probably doesn't recognize it, have a responsibility, London does, I think the international community through the United Nations. Now, the United Nations the Secretary General Special Representative in Baghdad has been comparatively vocal, and after a few missteps, I think has supported the demonstrations. But I think where the international community come in is through mediation. The demonstrators quite rightly feel isolated, feel persecuted, the subject of intense violent suppression. The international community could come in and mediate between the powers that be and the demonstrators and try and find a way forward, because the gap is so huge that the sense of hatred from some in the ruling elite versus a sense of understandable and deep mistrust by the demonstrators, that somehow a compromise needs to be moved forward. And internationally, both governments and the UN haven't been as active and as forward-leaning as they could be.
Can I answer the question on Qassem Soleimani and his role? So in 2014, when ISIS took over 1/3 of Iraq, the Turks left, the Americans weren't there, and most Iraqi politicians, whether they're Shia or Kurdish or Sunnis, turned to Qassem Soleimani and to Iran. And even the KDP admitted in August 2014 that if it was not for Iran, ISIS could have taken over Erbil. And many in Baghdad think that that could have happened in the south. So what his role was to bring together these networks of relationships that Iran has, because unlike the US, which is very transactional with who they deal with in Iraq, Iran has long-term networks and relationships with all these actors that are not based on ethno-sectarian lines often, although sometimes they are. So his role was very much in bringing together, let's say, as the state crumbled, as the Iraqi army crumbled, bringing together different militias to help support and stop some of these other cities from being taken over by ISIS.
Can I ask you, where's ISIS now as a result of his disappearance from the scene?
So, I mean, people are looking at this. So obviously the bigger question is what happens if the US leave? Because ISIS, there's still a few thousand ISIS sort of underground in parts of Iraq, particularly in areas where you have tensions between different armed groups that have defeated ISIS, and now they're fighting each other in different ways of parts of Iraq. So the biggest concern, I think, is it's not just the US leaving, but what happens to NATO and other European missions that are there, both diplomatically and sort of militarily, because a lot of them rely on the US for cover, and that's important in Baghdad and Iraq. The US will be there. And because of that, I think it's safe to say that most Iraqis and also many parts of the Iranian regime would not want Iraq to either become sort of a pariah state, sanctioned, or fall again to ISIS. Because unlike any other countries where Iran has so much influence, Iraq is on its border. And I think 2014 was a wake-up call for Iran that the stability of Iraq, it can't be too strong, but it cannot be too weak.
Okay, thank you. A final note from me, since you mentioned it on Syria, and since the panel is called Implications for the Middle East. As you can see, we kind of gave you the answer here. Iraq looms large. For me, I don't think that the killing of Soleimani is going to have huge repercussions in Syria. I think Iraq is where it's at, and as you can see, the repercussions are mostly political rather than military. I think Iran, in my view, is going to be forced to prioritize its engagement in the region. I think Iraq will always matter for all the reasons outlined just now. Syria is a bit more, I think, transactional compared to how Iraq is for Iran right now. Hezbollah remains very important, and I see a reinvigoration of Lebanese-Iraqi dynamics, somehow bypassing Syria, perhaps rolling back Iran's hands-on involvement in Syria to something resembling pre-2011. So not disappearing, not giving up, not leaving, but changing the way Iran operates through its proxies and allies inside Syria. On that note, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Sorry to all those who couldn't ask questions, but hopefully we'll do some more, and join me in thanking the panel.